The liberal establishment's been talking about unity a lot recently. But is that even possible, or, for that matter, desirable? How do we achieve such a thing? And what about those of us who are not especially fans of the liberal establishment? How do we want to be unified with them? As it stands, a not insignificant number of Americans and people in Canada and abroad as well have been recruited into what's effectively a cult. This conspiracy theory milieu that contains QAnon, that contains the MAGA crew, all the other conspiracy theories from 5G to vaccine nonsense to all those sorts of things. They're living in entirely different worlds, entirely different ways of knowing the world. So how do we, who share a world, even hope to get along with the people that don't believe in the reality that we exist in? And from my perspective, there's a lot of things that the liberal establishment and liberals in general believe that don't actually make any sense. They, from my perspective, are brainwashed, delusional for that matter. It's difficult for me to actually get through to people sometimes because they see things that are self-evident and commonsensical that I see as nonsensical. And this isn't even a matter of ideological difference, a matter of how we want the world to be. It's a matter of how they see reality is incoherent from my perspective, and probably vice versa. I've spoken before about the narrative construction of reality. If you want to see that video, you can do so up there. What I basically mean in short is that stories are how we construct the way that we see the world. We're narratively constructed creatures. We're good at dealing with just isolated facts, but we're much better when those facts are encoded in a temporal and narrative construct. We're much better at thinking about social realities and temporal realities and causality than we are about thinking about just facts. And so when we hear a compelling story, it's easier to change our mind about the way the world is than it would be approaching it rationally. Rational analysis doesn't actually enter into most of these worldview aspects. For a lot of people in the world, religion configures their basic reality. The narratives of Christianity or Judaism or Islam ends up setting the standard for the way the world is. The cosmology, your creation myth, all of the aspects about morality and what a human being really is and what the relation of the human being is to the rest of the world. Whether it's individualistic or communalistic or mystical or non-mystical, dualistic, monistic. There's all sorts of variations in this. But religion isn't the only source for these sorts of reality-creating narratives. For those of us who grew up secular, we might have picked up some vestiges of the religious narrative, but we may have had that narrative set by other means. I, for one, grew up with a lot of Star Trek. The United Federation of Planets and Starfleet really shaped the way that I see the world, the communalistic, non-materialistic way of regarding other human beings and, aliens that are equals to ourselves. Whether it's obvious or not, these narratives are seeded throughout all of the media that we consume. As children, we're exposed to cartoons that have subtle reality-configuring aspects to them. If you look with a critical eye, you can even see pro-capitalist sentiments in Looney Tunes cartoons. There's this underlying message of shaping a good citizen under capitalism in all of these media. There's also many parables and fairy tales that take the form of allegory that also configure this reality, from The Boy Who Cried Wolf, or Red Riding Hood, or Chicken Little, or all the other ones you can possibly think of. Even if we're not consciously thinking about these parables and these media and these religious narratives, they do set the standard for the way that we think about the world, what it's possible to think, and how we address objects and other people and even our own lives. Our place in the world and the shape that it takes is set really at an early age, and it's much more difficult to change that reality once it's been set than it is to generate a new one. This is much less about telling you the facts of the world, programming you with a set of ideas, and much more about setting the parameters on which you can think ideas and form facts about the world. These are the basic things that underlie all of your other epistemological, rational constructs. And as such, it's not very easy to address these worldview issues with reason. If it were a set of rational facts that you're trying to change someone's mind about, it would be one thing. But this is more like the aesthetic sense for the way the world is. So it's like trying to convince someone that their favorite painting is actually bad by explaining art theory at them. It's never going to work. You've probably experienced this if you've ever tried to talk someone out of one of these conspiracy fantasies, or for that matter, if you've ever had a religious or theological discussion with someone. Pointing out the logical inconsistencies and reciting facts just doesn't really make any difference. Even though you can see clearly that these things make sense, to them it's actually nonsense that you're making. It doesn't correspond with their general framework of reality, and so whatever you're saying is basically just gibberish. But to someone that lives in this worldview, it's actually, it feels like a personal attack when you start to undermine this narrative that frames their reality, because that is the basis of their person. If you start to undermine or start to critique the way that they see the world, it's actually a critique of themselves rather than a critique of the facts that they hold. Politically speaking, a meme came across my desk a number of years ago that has really stuck with me, where trying to convince a conservative or right-wing person that we should support social programs, it comes down to, I don't know how to explain to you that you should care about people. Because that's just it. It's not about explaining the best policy. It's not about convincing people that this course of action will be best for everyone. It's a matter of changing people's mind to see that all people matter, and all people should be valued, and all people should be taken care of, and it's a worthy use of our collective resources to do so. It's not a matter of convincing them that the budget needs to be set in such and such a way. It's a matter of changing their view of people at large. It's a similar matter for conspiracy fanaticists. Oh, my macaroni and cheese timer is up. My macaroni and cheese timer is up. The worldview that they've generated has a very strong narrative structure to it. It's full of all of these evil people in evil positions doing evil things, and that's quite compelling. It generates a visceral sense of anger and hatred and a righteous vengeance that creeps out, and this is why they're so hostile. But it's also why it's difficult to change their minds. As this modern conspiracy movement has evolved, it went from your standard decentralized, basically atomized set of conspiracy theories into now this concentrated, hierarchical, leaderful movement in the name of Q. When this mysterious figure showed up on the scene, the power of his narrative and the confidence of his prognostications were very enticing to people that really didn't have all that much sense for what's going on in the world. And this is how cults operate. They prey on people that don't have strong connections to the world as it is, may feel alienated, may feel isolated, and certainly confused and angry about the state of the world and their place in it. This is why for more traditional cults, it's often young people, often ones that are alienated from their parents in some way or who don't have strong connections to their surrounding culture. Usually what happens is the cult will present a narrative that is strong enough that it gives them some explanatory power for the displeasure that they feel in their world. And then past that point, it becomes a matter of drawing them away from their existing connections and isolating them into this cul-de-sac of conventional reasoning. For traditional cults, this usually means also physical isolation. The cult member is encouraged to move away from their friends, family, and community and join the cult physically where they are based, and cut off all contact with those who they've had in their former life. Anyone who doesn't believe in the cult, anyone who's not an adherent to the cult's beliefs, is the enemy. And so as such, they're cut off, they're drawn away from that. What's different about the Q cult, of course, is that it's decentralized. It's not located in a physical geography. It's distributed among the internet, and so it doesn't have that ability to physically isolate the members. But what it lacks in physical infrastructure, it makes up for in, well, hostility. If you have someone in your life that's been lost to this QAnon thing and the related conspiracy fantasies, you've probably experienced them aggressively cutting you off, pushing you out of their life. And anytime that you try to intervene, anytime you try and apply reason to their situation, they become more and more hostile. They reject any sort of insights and inputs that you might have because, well, it threatens their worldview, as we've already seen. And so people become irrevocably lost in this thing. I don't, to my knowledge, have anyone in my social acquaintances that's fallen into the QAnon thing, but I do have a few other people that have fallen into related conspiracies. The folks that fell into this conspiracy world, they were already somewhat on the margin in the first place. They were anti-establishment, critical of government, that sort of thing. Folks that weren't really on board with the standard way of thinking about things. Which on the one hand, yeah, I mean, me neither. But on the other hand, this makes one quite recruitable into irrational thought. Those of us of an anti-establishment persuasion are often engaged in narrative undermining. We're doing our best to critique and challenge the narratives that are reinforcing the standard way of living. All of the pro-capitalist, pro-neoliberal, pro-whatever this is, this so-called democracy, which isn't really democratic, all the narratives that support and reinforce these things need to be challenged and critiqued and undermined so that they don't affect us and they don't recruit us into supporting the status quo. This can be a challenge at times because these things are built right into our worldview. It's the default way that we've been programmed in this society, and it's present in all of the narratives that we see in the world. But it is definitely possible to do this. One can look at a narrative critically and view the reason that follows from that narrative and reject it. But then there's a danger of a narrative vacuum taking its place. In the case of mainstream politics, we're presented with this choice of left versus right, where the right is conservative and the left is, well, not really left. It's more centrist, it's more liberal in nature. If we reject that and start viewing outside of this, the sky's the limit in terms of which political ideologies we want to follow. This can take the form of the far left, where I am, where I believe that all people are created with inalienable rights, that it's guided by justice, that all people deserve a minimum standard of living that allows them to operate as optimal human beings. But on the other hand, it can also lead to the far-right option, where there's an extreme hierarchization of people, where the people at the top, which usually includes the person that is falling into this ideology, are better than the people below them, and better than the people below them. Usually this is racial in nature and gender in nature. The white man is paramount and supreme, and then everyone else follows from that. Both of these ideologies are extreme by the standards that we have, but they're both also logically consistent. They're also rational from within their own logic. Once the narrative is generated that forms that worldview, any other beliefs that are related to that worldview make perfect sense. Now, it's obvious to me as a leftist that the stuff that the far right believes is totally incoherent. It doesn't make sense from my worldview, but from theirs, it's totally rational. And oftentimes this far-right worldview is generated by a conspiracy narrative. These conspiracy narratives are typically paradoxically simple while being complicated at the same time. They often have evil people involved, specific individuals that are responsible for all the problems in the world and, by extension, all the problems in the individual's world. There's usually some evil scheme involved that creates the motive for the bad guys, and it's typically just, I want to be in control of everything, or oftentimes it's something about population control or mind control or something like that. And I mean, these are rational concerns. One does not want to be herded up like cattle. One does not want to be controlled by some shadowy figure who's got their fingers on the strings of the puppetry. So, of course, the response to this concern, the hatred, the anger, the outrage, it's all perfectly rational. Of course, you would want not to have these evil people taking over the world and controlling your life. It's a very simple and straightforward narrative, but it's not exactly correct. Oftentimes, these schemes make no logical sense. Take, for example, the chemtrails conspiracy. If one were wanting to do population control or mind control or something like that, spraying it from the upper atmosphere would be incredibly inefficient. Wouldn't really even be all that effective, and it certainly wouldn't be targeted towards the people that you actually wanted to get. It would be much more efficient if you were to, say, add it to the water supply or the food supply or something like that. Planes overhead, well, there's also a perfectly rational explanation, if one's willing to believe in that explanation, that the air pressure changes and the soot from the exhaust of the jet engine causes water droplets to condense and then form clouds. It's pretty straightforward if one views it from a physics standpoint, but this narrative of evil people doing evil things makes a lot more sense to someone that is rejecting all authority. And yes, to reject the chemtrail hypothesis, you do kind of have to believe in an authority. You have to trust that what that authority is saying is true, because you've never been up in the upper atmosphere. You don't have a way to conclusively disprove the idea, but there is physics to explain it. And if you believe the physics, if you follow the expert's advice, it makes sense. Whereas the scientific explanation is boring, dull, has no narrative. The conspiracy involving the chemtrails has an exciting narrative. It gives the believer secret knowledge, information that grants them a sense of agency, a sense of control and awareness of what's going on in the world, and a sense that they're able to fight back against these evil people that have caused the problems in their life. The QAnon thing works the same way, except this involves an active and ongoing prophecy. This shadowy figure of Q has spun this narrative of evil people in the Democrat Party and in various other positions of power in the world that are all conspiring together towards some evil end. They're secret pedophiles and Satan worshippers and are just generally evil characters. And tied up with these evil people, this secret cabal, is a racialized form of knowledge where the people who are deemed to be inferior, genetically, racially, culturally, are by default on the side of the evil bad guys. And so under the banner of this Q phenomenon, the people that believe in it, the people that share this worldview, can band together against these evil people and hope to maybe defeat them. Also, they're being promised this idea that there's a mole in the secret government. Donald Trump is the hero. He's the one that's going to save everyone, and there'll be mass arrests, and it'll be a huge spectacle, and the world will be saved, and now I'll feel safe again, and everything will make sense. And even as this narrative has crumbled, even as the plan has shown to be false, and Donald Trump is not the hero that he's made out to be, some folks are still working to contort their worldview to match this mystical plan. Even though Q has disappeared, the folks that are immersed in this worldview are still working to reinforce it, to continue to believe it even stronger, and the evidence to the contrary just reinforces their belief in it. Some people, though, have started to break out. Like any cult, it is possible to escape. Just like any belief system, it's possible to change one's mind. But it's not easy. And also, when someone does leave something that's so all-encompassing, they've left all of their friends, they've left all their family, they've lost all of their connections with the outside world. And so it's very difficult to actually reintegrate with society. This is why the liberal establishment's been talking about unity recently and reconciliation. The trouble is, some of the people involved in this have done vile, abhorrent things, committed acts of violence against innocent people. And for that matter, even though one might leave the cult itself and leave behind the mentor figure that generates the cult, some of the associated beliefs might not automatically go away. The racism, the authoritarianism, that sort of thing, that could still persist and go back out into the real world. If we think about this as a cult, some of the same principles for deprogramming do apply here. Stephen Hazan is a psychologist that specializes in cult deprogramming, and he's developed what he calls the BITE model of authoritarian control. B stands for behavior control, so regulating the individual's physical reality, what they do, who it is that they see. I is for information control, where the information is withheld or modified or manipulated in some way through the narrative in order to make people believe what they need to believe in order to believe in this cult. This leads to the T, the thought control, which allows the cult members to believe this group's doctrine as the ultimate truth. The worldview is confined around them. And oftentimes this is accomplished through emotional control. By manipulating emotional affect, it becomes possible to access that underlying world-configuring narrative. Much like on the way into the cult, the way out of the cult is marked by a similar narrative vacuum. Without a central world-defining myth or narrative or story or worldview, it's very confusing for the individual who has recently left this. This is why they became involved in the cult in the first place, to replace that narrative void with something that makes sense, something that's simple, something that's understandable, something that speaks to the emotion. To resituate the former cult member into society, it's useful to generate a new narrative, to reconnect people with the people in their world, to provide them with a guiding principle behind their lives, and to provide them with some connection with reality and their community and the world around them. At their very best, this could be a role for a community of faith. And yes, you might argue that this is just another form of cult. And yes, some of them are, but not all of them. The central narrative of a healthy faith community involves this connection to community, the connection to the world at large, and the encouragement of reason, unclouded by this irrational doctrine. But of course, secular forms are also possible. Much like the people that have fallen into these conspiracy theories, I too am critical of the standard narrative of the world. I don't trust government. I don't trust the message that gets given to us by the mainstream media. I really don't believe a lot of what we're being told. I think most of it's lies, and I think we're being manipulated and brainwashed. So why haven't I joined a cult? Might be tempting to say, I'm impervious to brainwashing, I am too rational for that sort of thing, but I don't think that's really it. As we've seen, the internal rationality of all of these delusional beliefs is completely coherent. From inside that worldview, everyone thinks that they're thinking rationally. They think that they're objective. But the secret is, there is no such thing as objectivity. We're all just coming from our own perspectives. We're all looking at the world from different eyes. There's no way to know exactly the way things are, and the more complicated a system, i.e. civilization, the more complicated it is to even make any sort of value judgments. One could also make an appeal to the majority. Whatever the mainstream belief is, whatever it is that most people believe must be the case, because most people believe it. But obviously that's not the case either. A lot of people believe in things that definitely aren't true, and before the modern age, there was a lot of people that believed some very wrong stuff about stuff that we now know not to be the case. I tend to take the view of intersubjective agreement being the closest we can possibly get to objectivity. This isn't the same as majority agreement, but rather it's a constant process of negotiation as to what is true, what is false, what is right, what is wrong. This process of negotiation must take into account the needs and desires and the existence of all other subjects that are considering this rational proposition. In other words, you know if the tree is good by the goodness of its fruits. If a proposition leads to truth and justice and kindness and generosity and all the things that make for a good existence, then it's true enough as it is. If, however, it leads to hatred and fear and isolation and alienation, well, there's something wrong there. This shouldn't be confused with unpopular beliefs that turn out to be true. For example, Martin Luther King Jr. was pretty well universally hated in the United States until he was dead and whitewashed into some folk hero of American liberalism. The important part is being willing to suspend judgment and engage critically as well as engage collaboratively with your fellow subjects to construct a reality through which we can all live, work, exist. Living in one's own reality is pretty exhausting sometimes. And this is why, in such a confusing place, the cult can be a raft, something to cling on to, something that can give some sense for the world, some people that one can feel some camaraderie with. But this is just a dead end. This leads only into a further narrowing field of view. These simplified worldviews are easy to conceive of, easy to understand, but they don't include anyone else. They're exclusive worldviews. They're not able to engage with the outside world and generate intersubjective agreement. It's exclusive in nature rather than inclusive in nature. For those of us on the far left, it is still important to continue to undermine these dominant narratives. But we need to not leave a narrative vacuum. We need to present a narrative of our own, a worldview that we can aim for, rather than simply a critique against what exists as it is. This doesn't have to be universally shared. We don't have to agree on a specific world to get to. That's how you end up in some sort of totalitarianism. Instead, we need to be continually willing to negotiate, continually willing to collaborate and work together towards this better world that includes all of us, that rises up all of us so that we can all participate. The dominant narratives we have now are pretty exclusive, and this is what leads to people falling off and going towards these cults. If we had, though, a more inclusive narrative, a more inclusive society, then this sort of alienation wouldn't be quite so prevalent. People may not be so drawn into this exclusive, hierarchical mindset. And so we need to continue to advocate for this. We need to change people's minds. We need to educate people to make them understand that what we're aiming for is probably a good thing. And hopefully we can get their input as to how to make it even better. So thanks for listening to what I have to say. And I'd like to hear what you have to say. So if you have anything to share, if you have any questions or comments or concerns even, let me know. Leave a comment or send me a message or whatever else. And I do this daily, so if you enjoy my content, feel free to subscribe to the channel so you can keep up to date on what I'm doing next. And like the video if you would, because it does help out the channel. And I'm trying to build an audience here, so share it with your friends. So once again, thanks for watching, and see you tomorrow.